Well, first off, you said you were a fan, a
I
super
am a
fan, even I
fan.
think was the word.
I'm
All
a,
right,
I'm a
so
fan.
what? As such a busy person of such high prestige and sophistication, why would you?
I don't know
Why would
about
you?
that.
Why would you? Why would you spend time talking to me?
Well, oh, I think your ideas are fantastic. Dark centrism, meme adoption curves, the stuff you've done on memetics is fantastic. It's significantly added to the way I think about problems. Actually, Reed was the one who turned me onto your work, and then we subscribe to the channel. We watch your videos. Yeah, I think you have a substantive contribution to make to the domain of inquiry. I
So,
also think just to add on that. So I think those are helpful. They've helped me think, and I'm going to give a talk here pretty soon, and I'm going to talk about some of those ideas. I think memetics, people don't talk about that nearly enough. From Dawkins to Selfish Gene, was that 1973? We don't talk about it, and we don't talk about it in terms of are there freedom of belief? Is there How does that influence the idea that people can choose what they believe? Doxastic openness and closure. In the literature, it's called doxastic volunteerism from the Greek doxa, about whether people can choose their beliefs. And I think that thinking about things in terms of memetics allows you to make wide scale interventions in the culture. Now, that can be dark or not, to borrow a turn of phrase. That's where epistemology has to come first. You have to make sure you're intervening in the right way and the right things.
yeah, a meme is not good or bad. It simply is.
Yeah, what does that say about our ability to choose what we believe and to revise what it is that we believe and the strength of the meme? And I love the idea of sticky memes. They're sticky for good reasons and bad reasons. The bad is that the method of error correction has been turned off, or political correctness, blasphemy, etc. And that you're laughing. Are you
Well,
smiling?
no, because I definitely want to talk about this I would put in the kind of rationalist enlightenment camp. I am coming from
Correct.
the more, I would say my single biggest influence is OG Jordan Peterson. The
Hmm.
old lectures before his newer stuff and his move to the Daily Wire, which I was not a fan of. But that, like maps of meaning, that theory,
Yeah,
where there is and you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist, I would assume.
of course.
Okay, Ian McGilchrist, Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, I kind of put them in the same camp, which is a little bit different from the rationalist enlightenment camp, in that there's a lot of decision making and idea processing that occurs that is sub-rational. And so the memes that stick aren't necessarily the ones that have the means of error correcting in place. It's the memes that appeal to the innate psychological architecture of our mind that evolved over millions of years. So in the same way that we evolved to like the taste of sugar, our bodies literally reoriented to be able to find the taste of sugar compelling. Our minds reoriented to find certain ideas more compelling than others, and those would be the archetypes. And so the memes that stick aren't the rational ones. And I believe Deutsch, when I was talking to Brett Hall, makes a distinction between rational and anti-rational memes.
Correct.
And like what you do as street epistemology is you're trying to build the faculties of rationality, which I think is very good. My complication of that, my
Yeah.
problematization of that, I have a minor in gender studies, by the way, so I'm going to try and use gender,
Impressive.
the language I learned.
I'm intimidated now.
Yeah, exactly. My problematization of that is that when it comes to convincing people, when it comes to people adopting ideas, rationality is one mechanism to do it, but it's also just imitation of people we admire. So like I believe that Tylenol works because my doctor said it works, not because I've rationally evaluated it, or because all these social structures. And I believe that certain moral decisions are good because people I admire, when they act those out, or that's the behavior they act out. And
Yeah.
so maybe my question is, what do you think of, do you think there's a risk of we overemphasize rationality and its importance in administering what the word, I forgot the terminology used, cultural interventions, wide scale interventions?
Hmm.
Do you think we overestimate how necessary rationality is in that?
No, I think we underestimate it. But let me give you an example, if I
Yeah.
may. So you keep laughing. You keep
No,
smiling at what I'm saying.
no, it's good. Listen. There's nothing more interesting than people who I admire and are intelligent who are saying things that I disagree with that I'm pretty sure I'm right about. But I
Okay.
need to
Okay.
articulate it properly.
Okay. Well, we are both on the same page then. So
Excellent.
I tell you, I think we can have both of our cakes and eat it too. I think we can have the primitive amygdala part of our brain latches on to ideas, the kind of the vestiges of, pre-advent of grain 10,000 years ago. And I think we can have the more modern. So this is how I look at it. And let's see if we can find points of agreement here. Yes, it is true that, or actually, let's even back up so that there are good memes and bad memes. That is, I'll define a good meme as something that leads to the flourishing of society. We can bracket just broadly, consequentialist objections or what have you. And a bad meme is something that leads to kind of misery, despair, immiseration, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Broadly, would you agree with that?
I would even be more specific and say a good meme is one that serves genetic fitness, and a bad meme is one that undermines genetic fitness. Which is this is what Brett Weinstein would point out as memes are actually extended phenotypes of the genes.
Yeah, so that's why I didn't want to go down that area, because that lets in a whole range of consequentialist arguments that I'm not comfortable with.
Okay.
So for example, we should commit genocide against people like, we call them Roma now, they used to call them gypsies, who, like, if that serves something useful.
I see what you're saying. Genetic fitness is not the final arbiter.
Yeah, so I think even thinking that way, it's not a positive heuristic. That's why I was framing it in the most broad possible terms.
Yeah, let's go with you. And maybe we can come back to that, because I might have some objections.
My thinking was that if we can find a point of agreement, then we can go to the next step and keep going until we can really hash out what the disagreement is. So, so then there are good memes and there are bad memes. Good memes lead to flourishing, and bad memes don't lead to non-flourishing, because there can be neutral memes, like funny little
TikTok trends.
Yeah, stuff like that. Bad memes lead to immiseration. I'm thinking like the only
Nazism,
example
communism,
I can give is
radical
Islam.
Islam.
Yeah. Okay, so then the question is, I think we should both agree that we should construct society and institutions in such a way that the means of error correction are enabled and protected. So as long as we protect the means of error correction, I think we can agree on this. And maybe a way to kind of lubricate the conversation is, those gold sieves that they used to just have when they pan for gold. If you looked at that in terms of a filter in which you dropped moral propositions in, or you drop memes in, the method of error correction does not mean that no bad memes will get through. It just means that it's less likely that bad memes will get through. And so as long as we can construct societies and institutions that allow for that. So once you have blasphemy laws or political correctness or what have you, bad memes become more sticky. Oh, is that clear? Was I clear?
Yeah. I mean, and this is the whole point of the First Amendment being, I would describe as sacred. That freedom of speech is the fundamental mechanism for error correction. And that's why free speech is so important. And what Peterson would point out is that is what's encapsulated in the Bible by identifying Jesus with the Logos. That it is the word that brings forth habitable order in all of his, Petersonian language. I would 100% agree, because, the ability to speak truthfully, to look out in the world, have awareness, not just like logic and rationality, but awareness, and then to articulate that must be protected at all times. Yes, that would be the ultimate meta meme,
and institutionalized.
Correct, which is another interesting point that I actually think is missing from my kind of applied sociological framework. Is I discount the role of institutionalization and institutional structures in the spread of memes, because I'm only viewing it sort of psychologically. Like, here's a meme. If someone comes into contact with it, what is the psychology of whether it's causing it to stick? But what I miss out on is the spread of memes happens through all kinds of institutional or mechanical kind of ways, and that's very important too. So
even within that, and not to flog a dead horse, if you will, one of the most important places where the method of error correction has to be preserved is any place that is an engine of knowledge production, specifically universities. And so in the last decade, the method of error correction was trammeled upon. Anybody who they didn't like your opinion or your questions, offices of equity, diversity, and inclusion, Title IX investigation, they were weaponized against dissenters. And so, Obama put those rules in, and there were initially good reasons for those to protect rank bias, et cetera. So I think we have a common agreement on preserving the method of error correction, why that's important. Maybe we can spill into the institutionalization of that. And then the next question becomes, well, I think I know what the next question becomes. What do you think?
Well, so maybe on the preserving the means of error correction. So free speech, the truthful exchange of ideas is the fundamental means of error correction. That's for sure. However,
you don't even need truthful. You just need the ability to you need to have some mechanism that allows a dialectic.
Sure.
Okay.
But then and this is what I was pushing back on with Brett, is you could make the case though that the anti-rationality or the not, I would say blasphemy is too strong of a word, but like memes that contain within them like forbidden, things to do. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's actually necessary because of the limits of human rationality. So the idea is there's kind of two ways to evaluate whether or not we should abide by a meme. Okay, one way is rational analysis and kind of taking it apart, science, even like theology, philosophy, mixing all that together, using our conscious mind to examine a meme and determine if abiding by that meme would be good or not. The other mechanism is sort of like a machine learning mechanism, so to speak, where this is the point of tradition, where human beings living together in enough instances run through the same game over and over and over again. And then we start to identify certain memes that lead to human flourishing through a very long process of trial and error, right? This is kind of the basic, like how AI is trained, right? And so the question becomes, are there some memes that are actually beyond the human ability to rationally evaluate because their stickiness, their goodness was determined over a long process of repeated trial and error rather than rational analysis in the current moment? And this would be like submission before God, submission before something bigger than you. Or even pointing out that rationality has its limits and there's some questions we should just never pursue or never go down.
God, there's so much. Have to cut you off because there's so much that you said. We could have a whole 2 hours on just this right there. I don't know if you ever read Donald Davidson's, he's now deceased, philosopher, on the very idea of a conceptual scheme. It's like if you can't translate a language, it's not a language. Once a language becomes translated, it's a conceptual scheme. And so you have traditions, right? And so some of those traditions are, this is when good or bad breaks down. It's not that they are necessarily good or bad, but they're adaptive and they allow the species to continue. I think my speculation is that diversity is one such a meme. It's not that it's good or bad. I mean, it's an empirical question to a large extent that became a moral question. But at this particular time in human history, when everybody was intermingling and airplanes, et cetera, maybe there was a kind of telos that we had to adapt the diversity meme so that at that particular point in our cultural and sociological evolution, we didn't kill each other, right? So maybe there are these ahistorical memetic spread of ideas like diversity that enable us to kind of comply with an evolutionary fitness. So that's just a speculation. So now I've been thinking a lot about Islam and the difference between Islam and Islamism. And I know there are many people who think there are no differences. And then there are popular figures like Gad Saad thinks there's no difference. And then there's scholars who work in the field who think there are a difference. But let's take your example of Islam. Why don't you unpack that? Because I have a considerable number of things to say about that.
Sorry, what are you asking me about? What did
So
I say
you
about Islam that you want me to
so
clarify?
you use the idea of the Peterson maps of meaning, and then
Hmm.
there are these historical traditional practices
Hmm.
that are memetically spread that in language I would use, they're bad sticky memes because the method of error correction has been disabled, unlike in science, for example, unlike what the peer review process ought to be or should be. And so you have these memes like Islam that spread through the sword and that have a kind of add to a kind of resiliency within the current culture that enables it to propagate itself. Again, you don't really have a control group, but that's the idea that the very adoption of certain memes gives the society more fitness and it
Yeah,
makes it more robust.
yeah, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for flourishing. So yeah, we'd agree on that.
Well,
Yeah, there's certain
that's
like
yeah.
ideologies can
It
spread.
doesn't mean it's true, right? I mean, it's like
Right.
that idea of less uh, false more often, right? So it's the idea of the gold sieve again. You want to be less wrong more often, and that's what science and it's ideally enables you to do, right?
Okay.
That's because that's the ultimate method of error correction. Whereas Islam or religion in general, specifically, have taken from canonical texts and I mean, we could talk about hermeneutics and exegesis and how you figure out if something is true in a text. But I think that's fascinating because it bears, I don't know, it bears direct relevance to the conversation. But even that idea, there are these two thinkers, Schleiermacher and Dilthey, who they were exegetes and they wanted to figure out if certain interpretations of the Bible were true or false, or how you can know a certain interpretation of the Bible. I mean, it's a really fascinating difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. Just a very quick rabbit hole, if you don't mind. But that's one of the things that's always interested me about Christianity is that the texts were translated through, Aramaic and then Greek and then different languages. You have different versions of the Bible, the King James version, etc. But you don't have that in Islam because it was all in Arabic. It's the same language. And so you have a different kind of interpretive meme that's operative in those systems that yields a convergence on specific behaviors. It gets more complicated because you have the hadiths, which are the sayings of Prophet
Mhm.
Muhammad, and you have the Quran. But anyway, I think your example of Islam was a really good example, and it's a great example of what happens when a meme sticks, but the method of error correction is turned off.
Well, okay. So let me pose to you this kind of idea, which is
Did
like the
any of that
tower.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, no. Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
100%. And everything also has to be evaluated over a certain time frame. So you could have a meme that rapidly takes over the world, just some crazy cult figure, I'm the new Jesus, and it actually spreads and the whole world becomes taken in by it, and then a year later it collapses because his underlying teachings are backwards or against their human nature or something like that, right? They plug into us, but then they don't actually provide us any moral guidance or whatever. So it does matter over what time frame. And I guess this is kind of my concern with sort of the Enlightenment rationality meme,
Yeah,
right?
please.
Which is, the whole story of the Tower of Babel is when you try to elevate human capacity to godlike status, it falls apart. So could it be the case, and this is sort of, I guess, I would say my general problem with liberalism, but it fits in the rational Enlightenment meme. I would use those words kind of synonymously. Is it not possible that the rate of progress and the rate of new knowledge generation is increasing at such a significant rate that the returns are starting to diminish? So instead of just science and technology is always moving progressively, it's actually a bell curve where now we're reaching to a point where actually new innovation and new knowledge is actually causing diminishing returns. Because it's sort of assumed that more knowledge of like physical reality is necessarily conducive with human flourishing. Like when Sam Altman says to Lex Friedman, I want to build AGI because I want to know the secrets of the universe, don't you? And I'm kind of like, no. I can understand why someone would want that, but to me, this should be adjudicated as like a society. Is this what we should be moving towards? Should we be generating new knowledge?
Those are different questions, though. So assume
Okay, go ahead.
that knowledge production is asymptotic. Then you have the other question of whether or not you should pursue the systems, whether or not you should pursue invention, a machine, how an intelligence,
Sure.
however you want to describe it, that would
Okay,
enable
let's start
you
with
to
the
discover
asymptotic
yeah.
point first.
Okay, so
And
I'm not
sorry,
sure.
just to clarify,
even,
Peter.
yeah,
And sorry, there's a little bit of delay, so hopefully I'm not interrupting too much.
yeah, we're good.
I don't mean asymptotic. I mean, because an asymptote would imply that the returns start to go to zero. I mean, the returns start to
Yes.
get negative. Where new
Negative.
progress.
How would they
yeah.
get negative? How,
Well, so
how would
for
they
example,
be, how would you unlearn something you learned?
okay, I guess it depends on what we're defining as learning versus like knowledge creation versus like technology. So maybe I would say like with like technology, like new technology, maybe not new knowledge per se, but new technology can certainly have diminishing returns. Meaning like
Sure.
for example, like we have no,
I
AI
got
and then
you.
okay, yeah. So and this is the concept of like hyper novelty. This is Brett Weinstein's term of like we're actually at a point where the rate of progress is now actually superseding our ability to adapt to it.
That's the
And to me
singularity idea.
Yeah, and it's like
One of them.
why should we be like maybe we shouldn't be moving into the singularity, or maybe the state should be restricting the rate of innovation to prevent
Okay.
over what do you call
There are
it?
two.
Over,
There are a bunch. There are multiple issues there.
okay.
Jeff Miller, the psychology professor from the University of New Mexico, is constantly on that side. He's not a Luddite, but he wants caps on this. That's another conversation.
Okay.
But what I'm unclear about is let's accept by fiat that it's true. If I don't like the framing of negative knowledge or negative learning, that's why I like the asymptote idea. But that's fine. We can. That's fine. I'm not sure how that demeans or degrades liberalism in any way.
Well, because the idea, so we can separate liberalism from maybe rationality, but like rational enlightenment. Although I just said earlier we can use them kind of synonymously. I guess if we use them all in the same boat, I would say it's like you said learning new knowledge. You don't buy the idea that new knowledge can degrade you. It's like, well,
No. Degrade. Like, what is the relationship between? I don't know. I guess it's key if you want to say an asymptote or like you can unlearn or unknow things that you once knew and kind of move backward. But how does that demean or diminish liberalism in any way? And I suppose we should define our terms.
okay, so with liberalism, I define liberalism as the philosophy that a society's highest value is individual freedom and individual autonomy, as opposed to like a police state, which is security, as opposed to a socialist state, which is equality. And liberalism's highest value is freedom. And part of freedom, tying it back to just what we're talking about, is like freedom to pursue progress and develop new technologies and all that. The example that should just put forward as the practical manifestation of this is
Sure.
like AI child abuse material, right? We are now at the point where we can create hyper realistic, hyper violent video of children being abused in the most horrible possible ways that one can imagine. Observing that, if you observe that kind of content, to me that's very bad. It should not be allowed, and I think it makes human beings worse for having observed it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to put a few caveats on that.
Yeah.
Not even caveats or I don't know, addendums or I agree with you. Liberalism does not yield the freedom to I mean, I guess we have to talk about it's a conversation about the limits of freedom, but for sure it has a detrimental psychological effect on the people who view it. But the other thing is, like, I would just never view that. And so people who would view that are already predisposed to view it in the first place. And so
I
it's
don't
a
necessarily
question
know
of-
that because I think this is a cultivation of vice argument. So it's like with pornography, you get increasingly, you start with very like mild pornography and then it gets increasingly hardcore and then you.
Okay, can I ask you a personal question?
Sure, please.
You don't feel the need to answer it. Are you
Okay.
straight?
I am straight, yes, despite what
Are
many
you
of my
purely-
critics will.
You're purely
claim.
straight. You're straight, right?
Yeah, well, listen,
to be
sexuality
clear.
is a spectrum. I learned this in gender studies, but
Oh,
yes,
then-
I've only,
Okay.
I,
Okay.
I only ever am interested in dating women.
You like
Yeah.
women. Okay.
Yes,
So
I'd like to start a
you don't-
family and all that stuff.
okay. Okay. So you don't watch gay pornography, right?
Correct. But if I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Really? Well, I don't watch gay pornography. I'm straight. But the point is, if you have no impetus or desire if you don't get off to children being tortured, why would you watch a video of children being tortured in the same way that we're both straight? So why would we watch gay pornography?
Well, okay, so this is I mean, you know, the whole like trans pornography thing, right? Where like, you start with, again, super like softcore porn or whatever, and then it goes, and then until you start watching like transgender porn or something like that. Like, you know who Matt McCusker is by any chance?
No.
You know who Shane Gillis is?
Yes.
Yeah, Shane Gillis and Matt McCusker are like two, they do comedy podcasts together. Matt McCusker was on Joe Rogan and talking about this exact phenomenon of like, yeah, there's all this transgender porn. It's like, well, why is that happening? It's because it's the novelty and the almost like forbiddenness of it or whatever. So it's like, yeah, I mean, I certainly believe that, like, you know, people who are into young children, that's a psychological defect in their brain. But I think people can be conditioned to do the most horrible things around. I mean,
for sure.
And I think I think like consistent access to, like, being able to freely access hyper realistic AI child abuse material. I guess, well, maybe my direct question would be, do you agree that the state should make that illegal, even though it doesn't technically? Okay, what is?
Yeah.
If I may,
please, because then I have a question for you.
Okay, yeah. So what is your rationale for making that illegal that wouldn't also apply to, like, you know? Well, let me just add, what's your rationale for making it illegal? Because it doesn't technically harm any individual in its production because it's AI generated, right?
Well, ultimately, it would be an empirical question. And so I remember years ago, you're probably too young to remember this, but John Ashcroft, I think he was the attorney general under Reagan, had some study in which he looked at prison inmates who were guilty of sex offenses. And he found that 100% of those people had watched pornography. But not all pornography is created equal. And I would argue that I don't think you could. There was a study a while ago, maybe over a decade ago. They tried to find, they needed a control group, and for men who watched pornography, men who didn't, and they couldn't find a control group. They couldn't find any men who didn't watch pornography. And so there is something to be said about that. But here's the empirical question nobody wants to ask. You know, Reed and I go around the world and we say to people, what would it take to change your mind? That's the primary question we have to facilitate a kind of doxastic openness with people. So I strongly believe, I would actually put myself on the spectrum for Spectrum Street epistemology of absolutely agree that AI child should be banned and severely punishable if caught with it, precisely because not only does it have a detrimental psychological effect on people, but I speculate that it would make people more likely to engage in the activities in real life. So it would lead to some kind of demonstrable harm against children. That, however, is an empirical question. So let's say we had a massive study in which we allowed some people to access, of course, this could never be done because it's grossly unethical, in which we allowed some people to access child with AI and other people to not access that. And we somehow, were able to monitor them closely to make sure that they got a steady dose of, violent child. And then we tracked them longitudinally. We did a longitudinal study. I would be willing to change my mind if we found out that the people who watched violent child were less likely to abuse children. So it could be that they discharge those, deviant isn't even the word, they discharge those urges in, masturbating to this pornography as opposed to acting this out. Now, I don't know that that's true. My suspicion is that would fuel them or motivate them to do horrible things to children, but I don't know that. And ultimately it's an empirical question, but we live in a society where even asking questions like that is strictly taboo because people are convinced that they have the right answers to moral questions. And you couldn't test anyway because the whole thing is unethical.
Well, okay,
like grossly unethical.
Yeah, so that's the point, though. So when we can't do the empirical, when we've run up into the limits of empirical and rational analysis, what do we have to default to? Because, like, for example, Richard Hanania, who I talked to, he's a, kind of mainstream-ish figure, defends AICSAM. And so it's like he's very rational, very intelligent, and you could say it's an empirical question. If people have if we allow people to have access to this, it could be net good, it could be net negative. But when we don't know, what do we default to? And given that we could never know, because you can't run that experiment, you can't just have it all out there. I suppose you could. People are advocating for that. When you don't know, my thing would be, well, we default to the basic moral principles that guided us for many, many thousands of years. Like hedonism is bad.
That's well, I don't know about the hedonism is bad thing, but one thing is you could evoke a kind of precautionary principle in the same way that we invoke a precautionary principle for environmental issues, not knowing whether or not, like Europeans far more so than Americans, not knowing if a certain substance or chemical is dangerous or harmful. We could invoke a certain kind of precautionary principle with regard to all of the suite of conceptual and actual issues that manifest as a result of new emerging technologies.
But how do you know what that precautionary principle is?
It's pretty simple. When in doubt, err on the side of don't do it. Like when in doubt, err on the side of don't put the chemical in the food.
Okay,
because you haven't tested its efficiency.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But then where are the limits of this? Because the Amish do this. When in doubt, don't allow a new technology into they're abiding by the same precautionary principle.
No, they're not. The Amish don't do that because it's not that, unless you change the threshold of harm, unless you redefine what harm is to such a ceiling level that anything that changes a way of life is intrinsically harmful. That's what the Amish have done. I mean, the Europeans, even countries like Germany, Scandinavia, Finland, Norway in particular, I'm thinking Denmark, Sweden, even those countries don't have that high of a threshold. So it has to be shown to be harmful. It is demonstrably shown. But anyway, my larger point is we can invoke ideally, I do believe that there are principles that you can derive rationally for the governance of society through reason. But as Krauss and others say, ultimately, those should be grounded in empirical principles as well. So you take the empirical phenomena and you figure out the kind of systems that you want to create and construct based upon what you know is factually true. But, there are so many questions now we can't explore factual questions. I mean, can I give you an example?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that is a forbidden topic all across the world is race and IQ. Like it's people have done tests on this. I mean, without opening this can of worms, one of the things that I find particularly interesting about this topic is that people who are broadly on the left were screaming up and down that there is no difference in race and IQ, that these things are the function of instruments or systemic oppression or racism, what have you. And yet they are the same people who are screaming the loudest about not allowing genetic tests on people to see if there are IQ differences between and among races. If you honestly believe that there are no differences, you would be screaming from the rooftop to demand genetic tests be done. Then all of that should be made public, freely funded, and available to everybody. But they didn't believe it. But they didn't believe it not on epistemic grounds, but on moral grounds, right? Or they profess not to believe it on moral grounds. So there are taboos in every society. Like in China, they have different taboos. You can't talk about the Uyghurs. But in our society, it's fine to talk about the Uyghurs. And in Islamic societies, I was talking to Zubi the other day, there are certain things you can't talk about in Dubai, but you can talk about, like every culture, etc., has certain areas in which the means of error correction are shut off. So those then become bad sticky memes. And again, I'm not making an argument for testing AI violent child people. That would be, I'm just saying we need to be honest and aware that of the larger system in which these principles are operative. And in no case do I think that is a stain on the basic fundamental tenets of liberalism from the Enlightenment onward.
Well, Okay, but Peter, so if you were arguing with a fellow liberal like Richard Hanania, and he was saying, Peter, this precautionary principle about AI child, this is just, fundamentalist Christian programming that's left over from the culture or whatever. New technology is new technology. Don't be a Luddite. Like, what is the rational argument against that? Why is your precautionary principle rationally superior to, Hanania's principle that, look, innovation is innovation. We don't regulate regular porn. We don't regulate people smoking. We don't regulate people drinking.
We
Individual
do
freedom.
regulate all of those things.
Well, sorry, we do regulate. We don't restrict it in the way that we would be talking about.
We do restrict it, all of those things.
We don't prevent people who are 21 from drinking alcohol. Or we don't prevent people who are 18 from smoking cigarettes. But but what we're discussing is we would prevent anyone of any age from accessing AI child abuse material. Right? So
that's why ultimately it's an empirical question. I mean, just think if we're wrong about this. Hold on. Let me just trace this line of thought down for a second. Just think if we're wrong about this, and if we introduced freely accessible torture porn of young children, even saying that makes me...
I know, I'm going to have to do some
editing
I know, to mute some things out.
Yeah. But let's say that we're wrong about this. If we're wrong about this, then actual children have been harmed, right? So if you're wrong, I mean, the stakes are very high here, right? These are not trivial.
Sorry, what do you mean
stakes.
if we're wrong about this? What do you mean?
Well, if we're wrong that, so my assumption is that prohibiting this, making it federally illegal, and having it carry literal prison sentence, criminally illegal to have it carry prison sentences. I don't know what the sentences would be. 10. I don't really know what they would be, but let's say that I'm incorrect, because my base assumption is that if people will view this, they'll be more likely to harm children. But that is an assumption. I'm just making that assumption. I don't actually know that that's true. I mean, it could be that people who watch this kind of filth, or I don't know, this kind of AI generated, I don't even want to call it pornography. It's kind of like a new classification of abuse porn.
Abuse material.
It could be that they discharge their urges and masturbate to that and don't harm children. I don't have that data. I don't know. And I know that a lot of people will watch this and be like, I know that this is true. Well, how do you know that? You don't have any data. You're just trying to make an argument for that. It's an argument I personally agree with, but I think that to extend the confidence beyond the warrant of the evidence, right? That's why reason will only get you so far. You need actual evidence. You need empiricism. Like, you need a mix of reason and evidence to figure out what the best public policies are going to be. And so go ahead. No, go ahead.
I would say this, and my claim would be religious traditions are actually a form of evidence, because they're, and it depends on which ones we're talking about. Like, slavery, and certain other ones are, that's not what I'm talking about. But like the deepest idea is that, like, hedonism is bad, and let's just say the AI child abuse stuff is like the extreme form of hedonism, whatever. That tradition was derived from running the simulation of human nature over and over and over again, and that might actually be a better computational mechanism than our ability to rationally evaluate it in the here and now.
Okay. Yes, and I'm going to yes and you instead of yes but you. Yes, and that doesn't mean that the traditions lead to truth. That just means that traditions lead to some kind of social efficacy.
Human flourishing.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean any of those things are true. I mean, it could be that we adopt some. It could be that that we think that if you do push-ups 10 times a day, you're honoring your God, and everything will be great. But then the consequence of the populace in aggregate doing 10 push-ups a day of people who had never even thought of doing a push-up would be that it led to a better health outcome in aggregate. So, these things, it's not that the traditions evolved to have any truth filter or truth sieve like the gold. It's that it's a kind of efficacy that moves society in a particular direction for evolutionary sustainability. It's a kind of memetic, it's a kind of fitness that's ensured by the meme as a substructure that's operative below, it's a kind of memetic operating system that allows the system, human beings and creatures, to adapt to their environment, so that these are adaptive, not truth seeking.
But fair enough. Well, then the question becomes, which should we be optimizing for, truth or human flourishing?
Exactly. So here's a one way to think about it. Truth is univocal. Human flourishing is not.
Define univocal.
Univocality speaks with one voice. Truth as a Charles Sanders Peirce, like a community, community of ideal inquirers would converge on specific moral and epistemological propositions.
That's a hypothesis, right? That's an assumption. That's not.
No. I'm saying if you have to choose between truth and flourishing, because what's true and what flourishes, there could be a conflict. So how do you hierarchically prioritize, building systems and allowing memes to get out into the wild, so shall we say, if they're lead to flourishing but not true?
Well, so this then we don't have to do Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris on Darwinian truth and all that. I certainly fall more into the Darwinian truth camp. I think that's, but like I guess my basic belief is I do not believe that I have no reason to believe that the human mind and the capacity for rationality can comprehend the totality of reality.
Okay. Or I mean, is that a problem?
So not the totality of reality, but even enough of it that we can trust our rationality over the again, it's the key metaphor is the two computational mechanisms. Running the simulation over and over again versus like empirical analysis in the here and now using our tools and all that.
Got ya.
And I mean, I'm not an AI expert, but AI systems are trained with the running the trial and over again because that's a superior computational mechanism for generating whatever AI generates, truth or prediction or whatever, right? Versus just, well, we can do the analysis in the here and now. We can do both. Again, we can look at a tradition and say, look, well, why was strict sexual morality? Why did that evolve in religious traditions? Well, because STDs could kill you. I mean, AIDS almost killed a lot of people in the 80s. And that was a threat in the yeah, you're right. It did kill a lot. It could have wiped out the whole civilization, depending.
We also have traditions that are and if you've ever seen the rates of inbreeding in certain societies like Pakistan, they're just shocking. Like
sure. Yeah, exactly.
Utterly shocking. So we also have traditions that are not good and
correct.
Traditions that go ahead.
My point with the strict sexual morality is that tradition made sense for the environment. However, in our current era, where we have treatments for STDs, we have contraception, it makes that tradition doesn't actually necessarily hold true in the current environment. So, like, I don't believe in not having sex before marriage. But there are some traditions. You can think of a hierarchy. Like, strict sexual morality is kind of in the middle of the most important things about certain religions. But like the deepest ones about like, what is the purpose of life? What are the ultimate sins? And like, there's a reason that many religions converge on hedonism as like, this is wrong. And so if someone thinks, well, we can rationally, I think we can, I'm not going to accept that hedonism is bad until I have enough empirical evidence, because everything prior, all these religious traditions are superstitious beliefs that are not truth-seeking. That I guess I don't. That seems wrong. It seems like we're throwing out the data that we received from this computational mechanism that ran over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years.
So if you may, we don't know each other that well, but I'm going to accuse you of something now. I'm going to accuse you of what Jürgen Habermas accused Jacques Derrida of doing, a performative contradiction.
Okay.
So you are caught in a performative contradiction. So you're using reason to deconstruct reason. You're using the very tool and the very thing to deconstruct the thing itself, which is, again, a performative contradiction. So the way that you would figure out any of that is through reason. It's not through tradition, because tradition is by definition inherently sticky.
Well, I guess I'm using reason to identify what I believe the limits of reason are, and then I'm deferring to tradition for things that I think are beyond our reason, like the whole should we allow AI child abuse to be legal or not? I think we agree.
Well, what would be beyond reason?
What would be beyond reason? Well, like we talked about. I wish maybe we can pick a different example because it's less graphic, or we can just use the term CSAM is the AI CSAM. We can't. There's no way to run the study, like you said, ethically, of what would happen if we allow this technology to simply permeate society, sort of unregulated. Like once it happens, the cat's out of the bag. Or I guess you can, clamp down on it. So we can't know, which I think you agreed to, right? You pointed that out. We actually can't run the study on whether or not
we shouldn't run the study.
Yeah,
because if
right.
I'm wrong, it would lead to horrific consequences.
Right. So the empirical evidence is lacking.
Right.
So that's beyond our reason. So the precautionary principle.
No. You see what you just did? You see what you just did?
Me?
It's not beyond our reason. In fact, you just reasoned to it.
Okay, wait, go on. I'm confused. Hold on.
Well, you just used reason to figure that out. You didn't use tradition to figure that out. And so then you have a question of, right?
Well,
you just reasoned to that proposition that we don't have enough empirical evidence. How do we figure it out? Again, if you want to say that, well, how do you adjudicate between competing traditions? Or how do you, I don't buy that idea at all. I don't even, why would you defer to tradition?
Because like I said,
previous memetic fitness, it allows creatures, organisms to adapt to their environments.
Religious traditions that are universal and deep are more likely to be true. Like, and this is
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. In fact, it could be that traditions that have survived long enough are better at immiserating people and preventing them from accessing the method of error correction.
Well, if we agree that the fundamental mechanism of error correction is truthful speech, the ability to exchange ideas, and I would say truthfulness is the important component there.
That's coupled with the ability to question first principles, which is a method of error correction, right? That's free speech. That's cognitive liberty.
Yeah. But I guess maybe the analogy I'm using is reason is like a flashlight that you can shine on the world and you can see things for what they are. And like if you're close to it, you can see like a rock as a rock, and you can then navigate in the world as such. If you're looking down a tunnel, the flashlight will show you like what's right in front of you, and then it'll get kind of. But then the light doesn't show you what's at the end of the tunnel, right? And so like, if the flashlight is my point is there are things at the end of the tunnel that reason and rational analysis can't get us to, or I suppose we have to make assumptions, right? Like I can't prove that you're conscious, right? So am I entitled to believe that you're conscious? Or how would you? I mean, how do you rectify that? Because
that's a separate question. I think that the flashlight, in the history of philosophy, it's interesting. There's a long tradition of being as being seen, but I think it's really interesting that you chose to pick up the flashlight in the first place, as opposed to just defer to a particular tradition. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the conversation is at a juncture now where it's between traditions that are not rationally derivable versus things that are rationally derivable, but you do not have sufficient evidence to justify high levels of confidence in those propositions.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's true, why? Correct me if I'm wrong now, but your argument is that we ought to defer to traditions because they've been adaptive and they've allowed us to get to where we are.
With all kinds of caveats, because it depends on the tradition. Because there's a Christian apologetic argument that they try to undermine the theory of evolution by saying, well, hold on, you're saying evolution wired us for survival, not truth seeking, right? Which is what the claim of Darwinian evolution is. So then how do you know that evolution is true? Because the very mechanism that you're saying you were wired towards. But I don't find that convincing because of the flashlight point. It's like we have partial truths. We can get halfway there. And the fundamental way we evaluate that is what happens when we act it out in the world from like a William James kind of pragmatism point of view. Are you anti-pragmatism, or what do you think there's, not anti, do you think there's serious flaws in like William James pragmatism?
I do.
Philosophy? Okay.
And I don't subscribe to Peterson's pragmatism either. Right. I like, John Caputo was a great example of a pragmatist. I love a lot of William James stuff. I haven't read it in a while. And I love Peirce's stuff, and to a certain extent, Dewey. I love his critique of Descartes. I mean, there's some really interesting intellectual arguments, but I'm not, look, if it's a question of, does it work? And this is kind of the first Peterson debate with Harris. Does it work versus is it true? I think that opens a massive can of worms that I don't think we've prepared an epistemological infrastructure to have honest conversations about those things. And that's why, as distasteful as the examples were that you used, they were really good examples, because you have to use it with an extreme example so that you can understand not only what's at stake, but I mean, it should be a little jarring. If you're never jarred by any of these questions, then you're not seriously examining moral beliefs, the function of society, the rule of law, public policies. And so you can look at beige and vanilla things, which they do in universities all the time because they don't want to trigger people. But I think that there's something important to know when you're honest about what's at stake in these issues. And so as disturbing as that issue is, I think it's a good one to use. And I don't have the answer to those.
Yeah. No, I don't know if you saw this. There was a clip of Sam Harris going around where he was talking to Cenk Uygur about eating babies. And
no,
I assume some far left people were clipping them up and saying, look, he's a Epstein defender, or I don't know, whatever. But it's just like, it's you got to take the extreme example to illustrate the principle.